So you can remove a gene or a sequence of genes, replace them with new genes, and they'll attach seamlessly so it'll be as if they were always there?
Yep. Well, except to the extent they've already done damage to your body, that damage doesn't necessarily magically go away. But moving forward, it's as if they've always been there.
So what kind of things, once this technique is really perfected, what kind of things could we change? Presumably, if there are genes that make you more prone to disease, maybe we could fix those. But could we have overall improvements in a person, make people taller, stronger, smarter, all the desirable qualities that people might want?
So yes, no, and maybe. We should be able to change some of the traits, but some are going to be easier to change than others based on how much we know about them. As I said earlier, some things we know a lot about, some things we know a little about. I think it's useful to break them down into 4 categories. Diseases, we should be able to change the ones we understand, like Huntington's disease or sickle cell anemia, or some breast cancers, those that come from defects in BRCA1 or BRCA2, 2 kind of famous genes. The ones we don't understand, we can't help. Cosmetics. We should be able to change a baby's eye color eventually, or whether a man will have either male pattern baldness or very young white hair. Behavior. I don't think we're going to be very good at this, but we should be able to say 60% chance of being in the top half in sports or music or math. And finally, the easiest one, although trickier to change, but if you start early enough, you could do this too, boy or girl.
Now, where do you get the new genes from? Let's say you're replacing some old genes with new genes. Do you have to get the new genes from a tissue sample of another person, or are they simple enough chemically that maybe you can synthesize genes in the lab?
Yes, so for over 15 years, you've been able to go to a website, several websites, put in the sequence you want, give them your credit card number, and a few days later, a test tube shows up with that gene sequence in it. And you just use their companies who make their living synthesizing stretches of DNA for you.
Now, some people are a little bit troubled by the idea of changing human genomes. What are some of the ethical issues of this? Is there anything that can go wrong? I mean, you're just trying to make people better. What could be wrong with that?
Well, any place there are humans, there's human error. So things can certainly go wrong. We've actually tried a version of this that we call gene therapy for about 35 years. Hasn't really worked yet. There's no gene therapies approved in the United States by the FDA yet, although it's getting close. But in a very famous and sad case, an 18-year-old volunteer died as a result of a gene therapy experiment in 1999, Jesse Gelsinger. For him, it went wrong. So things can always go wrong. I think what people most worry about fall into a couple of categories. One is the safety. And again, you know, if you're making a baby this way, so if we did gene therapy on you or me, we're consenting, presumably competent adults. We decide, I'm willing to take this risk because I really want to avoid this disease or cure this disease. If it goes terribly wrong, some of our friends would be sad. But in the long run, we made a decision. It didn't work out. We're going to die anyway. It's not such a tragedy. If you make a baby using this and something goes wrong, the baby never volunteered for it. And that baby might have 60, 70, 80 years of terrible life because of your mistake. So making babies this way, the safety risks are serious. People, I think, appropriately worry about some of the fairness risks. If this is expensive and only rich people can get it, that may be kind of an ugly world. If this leads people to choose to make or have boys rather than girls, and we get a sex imbalance as exists in a number of countries around the world using more old-fashioned methods like ultrasound and abortion, that could be bad. And I think in some ways the toughest one of these equality issues involves people who currently have a genetic disability. If you have a child, let's say, with Down syndrome, and these techniques make it likely that no children will ever be born again, or very few children will be born with Down syndrome, how does that affect your child? His chances for research to work on his disease, his social support, the sort of stigmatization he gets. I once had a young woman who had a disease called spinal muscular atrophy that put her in a wheelchair. And it's a genetic disease. It gets worse as she ages. She was a Stanford grad, brilliant young woman. And she said, you know, this system you're talking about means I should never have been born. And I wanted to say, no, it doesn't really mean that. But in a way, it does say that her parents could have had a choice of having her with the disease or having another baby without the disease. So I find that really troubling.
I mean, should we hold back progress, ways of benefiting other people, because there are some people who wouldn't be eligible for those benefits? Would that be fair to the people who might still receive the benefits?
It depends on what you think of as fair.
There's also,
and that's an argument philosophers and theologians have been having for a long time.
there's also a legal issue. Let's say that they perform this procedure on a baby and the wrong gene goes in the wrong place and he's horribly deformed. Who's going to pay his medical bills for the rest of his life?
The doctor's malpractice insurance, most likely.
Which will probably put a lot of doctors out of business.
You know, that's an issue that the medical profession's already confronted. OBGYNs have some of the highest malpractice premiums in the country. The other sort of issue people are worried about is less tangible. You've got safety, you've got fairness, there are issues about coercion. What if the government says you can or can't do this or that? The one I think bothers most people is, to put a not very precise term on it, playing God. Are we playing God? Are we wise enough to make these decisions about the genes for our descendants? I've never been particularly taken with that argument. I think we clearly aren't wise enough to make perfect decisions, but that's not really the question unless you really believe that there is a God who's making all those decisions for each child. From my perspective, it is, are we better than chance? Are we better than the random mixing of genes that fertilization the old-fashioned way, making babies the old-fashioned way, gives us? And I think we can hope to be better than chance, although we can't be sure of it.
Are we doing this for the sake of making human generations better, or maybe people are doing it for their egos to see, look, the great things that I can achieve? Maybe that's not the best motive to do this kind of research.
So I think there are, well, research motives are complicated. People are doing it to try to relieve human suffering and to try to get tenure and to try to win the Nobel Prize. Motives are hard things. But I do think, for whatever motive, in the next 30 to 50 years, we're likely to see new ways of making babies. One of them will be genome editing. One of them, which we haven't really talked about, but which I think is going to be most important, is genome selection. You make 100 embryos. Because sequencing is so cheap, you test the genomes of all of them, and you say to the parents, which one do you want to move? And then a third way, and this plays into your egotism, but at a different, your egotism point, but at a different level, I think human reproductive cloning is probably going to happen sometime in the next few decades. So talk about egotism, you want to make a baby that's just like you. Human cloning, or just like somebody else you care about, human cloning gives you that opportunity. I used to think that wasn't going to happen. In the 15 years, 16 years after Dolly, nobody had succeeded in cloning a human embryo, despite lots of efforts. 2013, a group at Oregon did. So I think cloning is back on the table.
Now, to clone an embryo, let's say an embryo just has one cell initially, and it splits. Could you separate the two pieces, and now you have two identicals?
Yeah, people have done that, not in humans, but it could be done in humans. That's the way identical twins happen. At some stage, naturally, before the embryo gets too deeply implanted in the uterus and the pregnancy gets too far gone. So in the first 8-9 days after fertilization, it splits in two. They've got the same genes. They're identical twins. But of course, if you've known identical twins, you know that even though they got the exact same genes, they're not the exact same person.
Because maybe they want to be different. Maybe they both have a desire to not be like the other one.
You know, maybe, but I think it actually goes back. They're more like each other than any other two people will be like each other, but they're not the same. And I think that speaks to the importance of environment, of chance, of all sorts of factors we don't understand that affect, in some ways, not in every way, but affect how the genes play out. They won't affect what your blood type is, but they could well affect your intelligence or your susceptibility to a bunch of diseases.